Paul and Barnabas, is about halfway through their first missionary journey. They have gone to what we call Turkey today, which was Asia Minor at that time. They have gone inland, traveled north, then traveled east, and then they're going to be traveling back to the west and then south again as they get ready to go back to the city of Antioch. The 15th chapter that we'll get to a little bit later this evening is an extremely important chapter. There's a lot that is in it, and it is a pivotal point in the reaching of the Gentiles, simply because there arises a conflict between the Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians, and then that has to be solved. Going to the book of Acts, chapter 14. The sidelights that we'll see are talking about the gods of Asia Minor. We'll answer the question, was Barnabas an apostle? And we're going to talk about the appointing of elders in churches that were very young churches. I have known some congregations that were decades old, in which men had never moved in the direction of trying to qualify themselves to serve in the position of elder. I think most men would rather not have what they consider all the headaches that are involved with it. But a good congregation that's run well like it should be, then the work of an elder is a great joy, sort of like that of a preacher. We have evolved in church management into which oftentimes the preacher is doing much of the work of the elders are doing the works of the deacons, and the deacons are just kind of standing there and wearing their title in great pride and saying, I'm a deacon. It is expected that everybody should work as far as the church is concerned. It's a family. Everybody has a part. I have taken the position many years ago that every man in the congregation ought to work toward being eligible to serve as an elder in the congregation. That's simply the bottom line or the basis of being a good Christian man. There are really only three qualities that are assigned to elders that are not necessarily assigned to other men of the congregation. One is being apt to teach. Another is ruling well. And the other one slips in my mind right at the moment. So we have to understand that as we grow in our Christian fellowship, that our women, our ladies, our wives can move us and guide us and help us to have those qualities that are necessary to serve in God's kingdom, the church. The spotlight of this particular chapter is the mission and methods of the Lord. Going into a city, every city was different. And part of those differences was, as we'll see later on, the uproar at Ephesus over the statue of Diana, that many of the cities had a local deity that was their primary god. There might be other gods that were served in that community, but there was one that usually stood out and was the main one. It's sort of like in lots of Europe today that the religions that are there are state-operated religions. They are funded by the government, and you will find many times on a Sunday morning of worship a huge cathedral that's 3, 4, 5 times bigger than what we've got, having about the same number of people in them, because there is no real connection as far as those people are concerned to the Word or to the church itself. They see it simply as another government entity. The highlights in this particular chapter are about preaching at Iconium, preaching at Lystra and Derbe, the cripple that is healed at Lystra, people seeking to honor Paul and Barnabas, the message of the living God, trouble from Antioch and Iconium, going back to preach at Derbe, backtracking to confirm the churches or to encourage them, preaching at Perga, and then returning to Antioch. Those are the things that we'll see in this particular chapter. This map gives you an idea of this first missionary journey. They started out at Antioch of Syria. They end up going to Antioch of Pisidia. They start here at Antioch. They cross the Mediterranean to Cyprus. They go to Salamis. We showed a more intricate map of Cyprus where there were cities along the coast where they probably went and they preached. They came to Paphos, which was the Roman capital where the Roman governor had his quarters. They left there. They went to Attalia, which was on the seacoast. Then they traveled north to Antioch, over to Iconium, down to Lystra, down to Derbe, and then retraced their steps back to Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and then down to Perga, then to Attalia, and then they sailed back to Antioch. And this was the first missionary journey. The time of this was probably somewhere between 46 and 48. Probably took about 2 years. And the reason for that is the time that they spent in each of these places, and also the mode of travel, which was mostly by foot. This is not a tremendously huge area, but it's sort of like traveling around the state of Tennessee. If you were going to walk from here to Memphis, how long would it take you? Tom, how long would it take to walk from here to Memphis? All day, huh? Yeah, all day and all day and all day and all day and all day. So, you know, you can walk, about at a leisurely pace, about 4 miles, 4 to 6 miles in a day. Maybe if you're really long-legged, you might get as 10 miles in a day. And what is it, about 350 to 400 miles to Memphis? How much? 501. Okay, if you make 10 miles a day, you're talking about 50 days. So that's a little over, right around 2 months. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not willing to do that. There's Iconium, and that's where our lesson takes up this evening. It came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue. This is Saul and Barnabas. They went to the synagogue of the Jews and spoke, so that a great multitude of both the Jews and also of the Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil, affected against the brethren. It's kind of interesting that in the connection here of going to the synagogue, that there are Jews and Greeks. Now, there may have been Greeks visiting, but more likely these were proselytes. Generally, unless they had proselyted into the Jewish religion, they were sort of like having a bad dog back there. You just kind of stayed away from them. Years ago, when I taught a class on the eldership down in Lincoln, well, can't even remember the name of the county now. Down in Franklin, Tennessee, Winchester. Franklin County, Winchester. And one thing I wanted to do in this class so that the men that were in this class could have a good idea of the similitude of the church today and the synagogue. And so I took them to Nashville to the synagogue there, and it was kind of interesting because they made us sit on the back row, and they put a guard on us. They said he was an interpreter, and that he would tell us if we had questions, he would answer the questions. But he was a guard. He was trying to keep us from touching anything that was holy as far as they were concerned. We were unclean Gentiles. And it was kind of interesting because I had a very good conversation with their rabbi, and he was very cordial and invited us to be sure to come, and it was an interesting visit. They did not ask us to speak. So they remained there for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who testified to the word of his grace by granting signs and wonders to be done through them. But the residents of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. Contention, contention, contention. The church has not changed much in about 2,000 years. We still have disgruntled brethren that sometimes get their nose crooked over some things that they need to be very careful about. How long they stayed, we're not sure, but it was a situation in which there was difficulty over what they were teaching. And some of the Jews that didn't believe were the ones that stirred them up. It's just like saying, if the elders announced that we're going to change the color of the carpet in here, there would be a slight uprising. There would be some that say, well, why are we going to change from red? We've had red for how many years, Ray? How long has this red carpet been down? 125 years? I think you've heard me say this before. One place I preached and we built a new auditorium, and it got down to putting carpet in. And they asked me, said, what is your opinion about carpet? I said, I don't care what you put down. I said, you can put down black with yellow polka dots on it. And I said, I can preach just as well on it as I can a red carpet or a brown carpet, whatever you want. And I said, and when you put something down, if you don't like it after you put it down, just bring in a whole lot of folks and we'll wear it out in about 3 years and have to replace it. I said, that's no big deal. But some made a big deal out of it, as oftentimes the little things make the biggest deals. So there was an attempt by both the Gentiles and the Jews to mistreat them and to stone them. And when they heard about it, they fled to Lystra and to Derbe and the cities of Lycaonia and to the surrounding country, and there they continued proclaiming the good news. Here is one of the ruins at Lystra. And you can see that the architects of both the Roman and also the Greek empires were fantastically advanced for their day and time. Now, how that they did most of this beautiful stuff, I have no idea. And most archaeologists and most historians don't know either. But to make these beautiful pillars, to set them in place, put the capiters upon them, and to make a second or even a third story is a remarkable thing. And you see all of the tourists that are there looking at this, and look at the pavement where they're standing. Huge stones, and yet it was, in most of these places, they're almost perfectly level. And you wonder how that they were capable of doing that. They just did it. In Lystra, there was a man that was sitting there that could not use his feet. He had never walked because he'd been crippled from birth. He listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked at him intently, and seeing that he had faith to be healed, he said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And the man sprang up and he began to walk. Sometimes these translations are misleading. The concept of seeing that he had faith to be healed, if you've watched the faith healers on television, sometimes when a person comes in and nothing changes after they do their thing, they'll tell that person, you just don't have enough faith. The faith that this man had was that Paul could do something for him. Not that he necessarily believed that he was going to be healed and could walk again. But as Peter was going into the temple, this man who asked for alms or for money was expecting to receive some money. And Peter told him, says, silver and gold, I don't have any. But what I've got, I'm going to give it to you. Get up and walk. And the man did, which was worth a whole lot more than any kind of money that he could have received or would have received. What does it mean to have faith to be healed? Well, he had the kind of faith as it was proper that he should be healed. This man believed that Jesus is the Christ of the Son of God, and that through him he could have salvation from sin and be healed from his infirmity. Now notice, he listened to what Paul was saying. What Paul was saying was not going around saying that if you're crippled, we're going to heal you. What Paul was saying, he was teaching about Jesus. And this is what the man believed. He had faith in Jesus. I have faith that when I get to heaven, I'm going to have hair on my head. I don't know if I will or not. It really doesn't make a lot of difference. But we also have to understand that the whole situation of heaven is going to be very different from what it is here upon the face of this earth. Now, what we receive in the church is only a glimpse of what we will finally find in heaven. You thought about what good it would have done to cure a person that didn't believe in Christ? The healing was a type of reward for the man's trust or faith in the power of God and Christ. God does not heal the unbeliever to make them believe in him. That would go against the concept of a man having free will. That would make the person believe in God against his or her will. God does not work that way. Now, I think that's a little hard for some people to grasp. But the whole purpose of listening to this and seeing what was happening in the church in the first century is to begin to understand how that God operates. He operates through, first of all, his word, and Jesus is identified as being the word in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. We have an illustration during the life of Jesus about the 10 lepers and how that this kind of worked. And this comes from Luke 17. Jesus entered a village. 10 lepers approached him. They kept their distance, which was required by the law of Moses. They had to stand off, they had to cover their face, and they had to cry, unclean, unclean. And if you were on the path, they got off the path. That was what was required of them. And they called out saying, Jesus, Master, have mercy on us. This indicates that they had heard about Jesus, and 2, they heard that Jesus performed miracles. When he saw them, he said, go and show yourselves to the priest. This was what was required of a person when they were healed from leprosy, or when they thought they were healed from leprosy. They would go to the priest would examine them, and he would proclaim that they were clean. Then they had to offer a sacrifice of thanks that they had been made clean. But one of them, when he saw that he was healed, he turned back, he praised God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. He threw himself face down on the ground. And he was a Samaritan. And Jesus says, weren't there 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? And then he said to him, get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well. The tying of faith to the healing of individuals has to be in the faith that they had that Jesus could do something, or that Jesus is the Son of God. This is basically what we confess when we stand before the audience in order to be baptized. We are asked, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? And we say, yes, I do. And it's in this kind of faith that we begin to receive the blessings that God can bestow upon us. In this day and time, in these instances, these were situations in which there was a physical healing of some kind of malady. In Luke, the 17th chapter, it's leprosy. In the passage that we're looking at in the book of Acts, it's a man who had been crippled his entire life and unable to walk. Verse 11, 12, anytime that you have a comment that you'd like to make or you have a question, flag me down, because I'm just going to keep on going if you don't. I'm used to teaching adult classes, and most of the time everybody thinks of a question after the class is over. So if you think of one, share it with us. The crowd saw that Paul had done. They shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." They're excited. They'd never seen anything like this before. Barnabas they called Zeus. Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates, and he and the crowds wanted to offer a sacrifice. It's like a festival. It's like a county fair. It's like a circus. These people had never seen anything like this before. They had seen these images of their gods, but they had never seen a living God before. What do they expect of their God? They expect of their God to take care of them. And in this particular instance, anybody that could say to this man, "Get up and walk," was certainly a God. And if he had that kind of power, he certainly was the highest of the gods. And so they were going to offer sacrifice to thank the God they thought Barnabas and Paul were. They called Barnabas Zeus, which is also Jupiter. Paul they called Hermes, which is also known as Mercury, because he was the chief speaker. Do any of you remember what the symbol of the FTD florist is? Do you remember? It's what? It's Mercury. He's got this little pot on his head with wings on it, and he's got wings on his feet. He's the messenger. And what it was his message was bringing flowers. And they just adopted that. This is the difference between the Greek gods and the Roman gods, the differences between the two. Zeus and Hermes were Greek, and Jupiter and Mercury were Roman gods. And here they are, they're bowing down. There's the priest bringing the bullock. He's ready to offer the sacrifice, and Barnabas and Paul get a little excited on this. Who was Jupiter? He was regarded by the ancient Greeks and Romans as the chief of gods. He was probably worshipped by the people of Lystra as their main deity, as his temple was there just outside their city. Who was Mercurius, or Mercury, or Hermes? He was looked upon as the attendant and messenger or spokesman for Jupiter or Zeus. So it was logical that he would be with him. So the apostles Barnabas and Paul. Now, isn't that an interesting statement? When the apostles Barnabas and Saul heard of it, they tore their clothes and they rushed into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We're just mortals like you are, And we bring you good news that you should turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. What is the meaning of the term apostle? It means one who is sent. Who sent Barnabas and Saul? The church at Antioch of Syria. I think sometimes we may have made more out of the concept of apostles than was really written in the Scriptures. The 12 were known as the disciples of Jesus for the most part, and then later on they were named as apostles after they had been sent out to go out and to preach. In this particular passage, notice who is listed first: Barnabas and then Paul. But it's about this point in the book of Acts that Luke begins to take the idea and at least the concept that Paul has a greater role in all of this than Barnabas. And we'll see that coming a little bit further along. There they are, tearing their clothes. This was a sign of anguish. This was a sign of grief. This was a sign of showing people that you were not happy with the way things were going. Now, this term worthless things become interesting because in this particular passage, in other translations, some of them call them vanities, some call them useless things or worthless things. Whatever is vain is useless. Vanity is useless. Vanity is a false pride. It has to deal with thinking you're better than what you are, that what you have is better than what you really have. It's a false concept of thinking that things are right. And so Paul says, turn loose of these worthless things that you've got, these vanities. Therefore, their worship of such non-gods as Jupiter and Mercury was a useless worship. What good does it do to worship a stone image? You say, well, if I were doing it and I believed that that was my God, it might make me feel good. Well then, how about the God of light? Why don't we worship a chandelier? It's an inanimate object. It gives light. We can see as a result of it. I don't know that we really understand how that light works, but we put electrons through wires and it comes into the filament and then we've got light. Why don't we worship that? Well, some people have in times past. They've worshiped the sun, the moon, the stars. They've worshiped water. They've worshiped fire. Whatever they thought was grand in their life and whatever they thought had any kind of worth, that's what worship means, giving something worth or something in priority in their life. These were only imaginary deities conjured up on the minds of ignorant and superstitious men. Later on, we're going to find Paul talking in Athens to people who are superstitious. We have been cautious of using that word. It was used in the King James Version, so we're very much familiar with it. He says, I perceive that you are overly superstitious, too superstitious. And then he goes on to explain to them about the one living God. We'll get to that later in our studies. In verse 16, 17, and 18, he says, and this is in his speech, In past generations, God allowed all the nations to follow their own ways. Yet he has not left himself without a witness in doing good, giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons and filling you with food and your hearts with joy. Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the crowds from offering sacrifice to them. Here's Barnabas and Paul saying, don't do this, don't do this. We're trying to share with you what you need to know about the God of heaven and about this Jesus who is his son. But the Jews came there from Antioch and Iconium, and they won over the crowds. And they stoned Paul, and they dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. Why do you think they drug him out of the city? Yeah. Here they were having all this great joy, and the next thing you know, they've stoned the man thinking he's dead. If your dog dies and it's laying in your front yard, what do? Let it lay there? No. If a person dies, we usually send them to the mortuary, or we send them to the crematory, and they're cremated. We have a funeral service for them. We just don't let dead bodies lie around for several reasons. One, they draw carrion eaters, and secondly, disease can be spread from a decaying body. So they think they've killed him. They drag him out of the city. Those that are with him are fairly upset. Those that believed are also upset. But when the disciples surrounded him, he got up, he went into the city, and the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. I remember as a kid, we used to have rock fights. And they were fine until you got hit. And that's when you started crying, you went home. Fight was over as far as you were concerned. As long as you could take it to the enemy and throw rocks and chase them off, then that was fine. But if it turned and you got the raw end of it, and these are not small rocks when they stone a person. These are pretty good sized rocks. Their intention is to kill a person, not just to wound them. So Paul gets up, he goes back to the city, showing that he's not afraid of them. After they had proclaimed the good news in that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra. And then they went on to Iconium and then to Antioch. And they strengthened the souls of the disciples and encouraged them to continue in the faith, saying, "It is through many persecutions that we must enter the kingdom of God." Now, how do you confirm or strengthen a soul? Well, how do you confirm a reservation for an airline ticket? You show up, don't you? You say, "I have a reservation." If you go to a hotel, you go to the front desk and they say, "Can I help you?" And I said, "I have a reservation for tonight." And they look in their book and they'll find your name, and they'll want to see your driver's license to prove that you are who you are. And mostly that's to be sure that if you tear up their room, that they know who to get a hold of. And that's confirming a reservation. You go and you check on it to see if everything is in order. And all they were doing was going back to see the folks that they had baptized to see if they were still worshiping as they should, and encouraging them to remain faithful. They also taught that we must enter the kingdom through much tribulation. Well, what does that mean? Why must we enter the kingdom of God through much tribulation? Romans 5:3 says, "Not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation works patience, and patience experience, and experience hope." You're going to be tried and tested because of your faith in Jesus Christ at some time in your life. It's happened to me several times. I'm still around. It hasn't shaken my faith for somebody to be opposing to what I said. Not too long ago, there was a knock on my door on Saturday morning, and there were two women standing there from a different religious group, and they wanted to talk about Jesus, and they wanted to talk about the church, and we found out very quickly that what they believed the Bible said and what I believe the Bible said were two different things. For one thing, I believe in heaven, that it's not here on this earth, and they believe that heaven is going to be here on this earth. And I tried to challenge that. I said, you mean that we're going to have the same thing that we got right now, same old, same old? Well, no, well, it's going to be different. Well, I said, well, how is it going to be different? What's going to be different about it? I said, I will not have neighbors living across the street like I do now. They won't have to put a roof on their house every 5 to 10 years or 20 years. I said, their faucets won't leak. And they kind of got a little antsy about needing to be somewhere else. They didn't want to deal with me. I shouldn't have done that, but it was fun. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Glory. Something that is in a glorified state. Sometimes we think only of glory as being that beautiful light that emanates around the head of Jesus or God. But glory is more than just a beautiful light. Glory is being something special. Revelation 1:5 says he's made us priests and kings. We're told in another place that we're made co-heirs with Jesus. We inherit the same thing that he has. Now, can you think of anybody that's more important than the Son of God? What happens when we become a Christian? We become the sons and daughters of God. We have the same inheritance as Jesus. And that's one of the things that this tribulation comes upon us. And it helps us to be stronger. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 1 and 2, I think that is. No, it's 3:12. I must have been using David's computer. Yes, all that will live godly in Christ Jesus shall suffer persecution. It can come in a very harsh way, or it can come in a very subtle way. And you may not even know that you're being persecuted. Somebody may talk about you. I've been called water dog. I've been called three-legged duck because of baptism, and been called Campbellite. And I'm sort of like one fellow said one time, rather be Campbellite than no light at all. Well, I don't really follow as much of Alexander Campbell as maybe our neighbors think that I do, or we do. But in our last study that we had together, we dealt with a number of those differences. After they had appointed elders for them in each church, with prayer and fasting, they entrusted them to the Lord, to whom they had come to believe. Again, to point out how interesting that this is, that these early congregations, these very young congregations, had elders in them. And the only way that I can understand that they could possibly do this was that these were Jewish converts, or they were Gentile converts, very similar to Cornelius, who was a very, very honorable individual. And that very soon these people were placed in a position of guidance and leadership in the local congregations. Now you have to remember that most of these congregations were not very big. None of these passages talk about, except for a very few of them, talk about how great numbers of folks believed. Sometimes half the city, depending on how big the city was. Sometimes just a very few individuals. So what does it mean to ordain or to appoint elders? Well, just as the apostles had been appointed or ordained for a specific work of preaching the word of God, then elders of the church are appointed to their specific work as shepherds of the flock of God. What are these specific duties of elders? They're appointed to teach and to rule and to guide the congregation to which they themselves are members. Now, there's a variety of preachers' interpretations of what this means. And sometimes it causes problems. Preachers sometimes are as much the problem as they are the solution. Sometimes a man may not have the capability of standing before a congregation and delivering a lesson, but he may have other attributes that are very strong and very helpful. I think of a good brother that I knew in a congregation a number of years ago, one of the finest men I'd ever known, raised up fine children. All of his children were faithful to the Lord. His wife would have been a good elder's wife. But he couldn't read or write. And he said, I can't be an elder because I'm not apt to teach. And I sat down and talked with him one time, and I said, now, if a person came to your house and asked you, I said, what do I need to do to become a Christian? Could you tell him? He said, yeah. I said, just because you can't read or write doesn't mean you can't teach, or that you don't know how to tell a person how to become a Christian. I said, not everybody has the same qualification. Not everybody has the same capabilities and the same qualification. There are some teachers that are great teachers. There are some that are good teachers, and there are some that ought not to be teaching at all, but they do. They try. They want to. And we have to understand that there are always these levels that are found in the congregation. Some have great faith, some have little faith, some just have faith. And so in dealing with folks when you're preaching or when you're teaching, you have to be sure that you're reaching all levels of education, all levels of capability, and that you have to inspire people to do what they can do, not what they can't do. I don't know if you've noticed over the years, most preachers are not good song leaders. And I don't know what the problem there is, except that maybe they were never taught well, or taught how to lead singing or to teach music. But that doesn't disqualify them from being a good pulpit person or a good Bible class teacher. And so as a result, sometimes we may choose a person that may have weaknesses in one area but strengths in another, simply because that's just their characteristic. I knew of a preacher one time that had some of the finest lessons that I had ever heard anywhere. They were as good as anybody that ever produced, but he was a lousy preacher. He could not deliver it. He just didn't have the quality. He didn't have the voice. He couldn't project. He didn't have the feeling behind it. It was just as if he were reading a book. But the lessons were sound. They were great. They were wonderful. But he stayed a great number of years at that congregation. He did a lot of good. Acts 28 and verse 17, this is later on in our study. Paul goes to Miletus and he sends to Ephesus and he calls the elders of the church in Ephesus. And he tells them this in verses 28 through 30. You take heed, beware therefore of yourselves and to all the flock over the which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to feed the church of God, which he has purchased. And this covers both of them. Overseer is one who rules, who guides, who directs, who leads, and to feed the church of God, that is to teach, to preach, to give information to, that he has purchased with his own blood. Because I know that after I'm gone, grievous wolves will enter in among you, and not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things to draw away disciples after them. So this is one of those things that is given to us in the Scriptures, warning us and telling us that we need to be careful about who we appoint as elders of our congregation. 1 Timothy 3:2 says, "A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach." 1 Timothy 5:17, "Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those that labor in the word and doctrine." Passages that you are probably very familiar with. So then they passed through Pisidia, and they came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia, which is on the seacoast. And from there they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had completed. Here's another map that kind of shows you the same direction that they went. All the way to Antioch, to Iconium, to Laconia, Derbe, backtracked, came down to Perga, then over to Attalia, got on a boat and sailed back to Antioch. Actually, they went to Seleucia, and then they went on from there to Antioch. When they arrived, they called the church together, and they related all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith for the Gentiles. A congregation does itself dishonor by not calling their missionaries in at least once a year to give a report. The first place that I preached, I was a missionary for a large congregation. Ray's familiar with them, 4th Avenue Church in Franklin, Tennessee. And twice a year, they paid for a trip for me to come back and to preach, and also to give a report to the elders and to the church about things that had been done in the work that we were engaged in Barnesville, Georgia. So they share with them everything that has happened, and they make their report simply as agents or missionaries for the church, and this was fitting that they should make their report to them. And there they abode for a long time with the disciples. How long? It's not certain. They left Antioch in AD 45, and this first missionary journey was supposed to have occupied about 2 years. And how much time was devoted to the journey and how much time back at the city of Antioch is not clear, and probably somewhere around 3 to 4 years would probably be a pretty good estimate. And that brings us to the end of chapter 14. Now, I didn't move as fast tonight as I thought I was going to. Next week, we will take up the 15th chapter of the book of Acts and the great conference in Jerusalem over the conflict between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. We still have conflicts in the church, and it tells us how to deal with some of that. Any questions or observations that any of you would like to make about what we've looked at tonight? I thank you very much for being a very, very kind class tonight and not asking questions that I would probably have had trouble answering. Thank you very much.